January 1932, Zurich. Wolfgang Pauli, arguably the most feared mind in physics, the man who had just predicted a particle nobody could detect, walks into a psychiatrist's office and asks for help. He would spend the next 26 years writing down his dreams, 400 of them, and sending them to the man in that office, Carl Jung. If you've heard this story before, you've probably heard the version the internet tells. A Nobel-winning physicist discovers that quantum mechanics explains meaningful coincidence. Science quietly confirms the mystical. That version is wrong, and the real one is stranger and better documented than the myth. Because the first thing to understand about Pauli is that he is the last man on Earth you would expect in that office. At 25, he had formulated the exclusion principle, the rule that no two electrons can occupy the same quantum state. It is not a small idea. It is why atoms have structure, why the periodic table looks the way it does, and one of the reasons ordinary matter is stable at all. The work would win him the Nobel Prize in 1945. Einstein was among the scientists who nominated him. And just over a year before that Zurich appointment, he had done something bolder still. Energy appeared to be vanishing during radioactive decay, simply going missing. Rather than abandon the conservation of energy, Pauli proposed that an undetectable particle was carrying it away unseen. He announced it in December 1930 by letter. Because he couldn't attend the meeting himself, he was, in his own words, indispensable at a ball in Zurich that weekend. So the century's most consequential particle prediction was posted to a conference he skipped for a dance, addressed, "Dear radioactive ladies and gentlemen." He called the idea a desperate remedy. He was right. It took until 1956 to catch one. When the physicists who finally detected it sent word, Pauli's reply was one line: "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." And he was physics' most merciless critic. Colleagues called him the conscience of the field. A wrong idea would be demolished in a sentence. He is the origin of the most withering dismissal in science, that an argument was so confused it was not even wrong. That is the man who sat down week after week and wrote out his dreams. So this is not a story about a physicist going soft or a mystic in a lab coat. It's the story of a documented 26-year correspondence between two formidable minds. Fewer than 100 surviving letters, a book they published together, and one question neither of them could let go of. Whether the split we take for granted, mind on one side, matter on the other, is something we discovered about the world, or something we imposed on it. They never answered it. One of them ran an experiment to try, and the experiment failed. And he published the failure anyway. That's the part worth staying for. First, why Pauli was in that office at all. The years before had taken him apart. In November 1927, his mother died by suicide, months after his father left her. 2 years later, Pauli married. The marriage lasted a matter of months. By 1930, he was divorced, drinking heavily, and quarreling publicly in a city where everyone knew his face. His father suggested he see Carl Jung, then lecturing in Zurich. Pauli had attended some of those lectures. He wrote, and an appointment was made. And then something happened that tells you a great deal about how seriously both men took this. Jung met him. Briefly, perhaps 20 minutes. And then sent Pauli a note referring him to somebody else, a young analyst named Erna Rosenbaum, who was, at that point, barely started in the profession. Why? There are 2 documented accounts, so it's worth giving you both rather than picking the tidier one. In Pauli's own telling, Jung said the trouble was with women, so a female analyst would serve him better. Elsewhere, Jung gave a different reason entirely. He said Pauli arrived so full of what he called archaic material, dreams thick with old, recurring symbolic imagery, that he didn't want his own theories leaking into them before he had seen what those dreams did on their own. Whatever the real reason, the effect was the same, and methodologically, it's the interesting part. Rosenbaum's instruction was simple: write the dreams down. Don't interpret. Just record. For about 5 months she took them down. Then Pauli carried on alone for 3 months more. By the end, he had recorded something like 400 dreams. Only then did Jung take him on directly, for about 2 years. Now, what does a theoretical physicist dream about? The one that became famous, Pauli called the world clock, a vision of a great cosmic clock, built of intersecting circles turning at different rhythms, the whole structure somehow complete and balanced. Jung read it as a mandala, an image of wholeness, of parts, held in a single order. And that dream ended up in print, which is the part almost nobody knows. In 1944, Jung built a book around a long sequence of Pauli's dreams, publishing analyses of roughly 80 of them. It's called Psychology and Alchemy. He kept the dreamer's identity secret. At Pauli's request, he concealed even the fact that the man was a physicist. So for decades, students of Jung studied that dream series closely, knowing an anonymous patient's inner life in enormous detail, with no idea they were reading the unconscious of one of the founders of quantum mechanics. The therapy ended. The conversation didn't. From 1932 until Pauli's death in 1958, the two men wrote to each other. The surviving letters have been published. They are not therapy notes. By the end, they read as two colleagues arguing at a high level about a problem they had come at from opposite directions. The problem was this. Jung had spent his career finding that certain images recur across cultures with no contact between them. Patterns he called archetypes. He thought the psyche had structure and that the structure was not merely personal. Pauli had spent his career finding that matter has structure too, that reality at the smallest scale obeys strict, strange rules no one would have guessed by looking. And both men, separately, had hit the same suspicion, that the hard boundary between the inner world and the outer one, mind here, matter there, might not be a discovery about nature. It might be an assumption we brought with us. They gave the idea a name, borrowed from medieval philosophy and alchemy: unus mundus, one world. The proposal that psyche and matter are not two substances but two aspects of a single underlying reality, neither purely mental nor purely physical. That is not a claim modern physics makes, or modern psychology. It was a private conjecture, argued carefully, never demonstrated. Which brings us to 1952, and to the book, and to the single biggest thing the popular version gets wrong. That year, Jung and Pauli published a volume together. In English, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, 2 essays, one by each man. Jung's is the famous one, Synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle. His attempt to argue that some coincidences between an inner state and an outer event are connected by meaning rather than by cause. Now ask most people who know of this book what Pauli's half contains, and they'll say it's the physics, the quantum mechanics propping up Jung's idea, the scientific backing. It isn't, not remotely. Pauli's essay is titled The Influence of Archetypal Ideas on the Scientific Theories of Kepler. And the question behind it is one every working scientist recognizes. Why do brilliant people so often see the shape of an answer before they can justify it? Where does the hunch come from? The sense that a theory is right because it is beautiful, or symmetrical, or simple. Pauli went looking for a case study and chose Johannes Kepler, His argument is that Kepler's embrace of a sun-centered cosmos was shaped, in part, by an inherited image he never examined, the Trinity. A prior conviction about threeness, about a center and what radiates from it, doing quiet work underneath what looked like pure observation. Pauli read Kepler in the original Latin and German to write it. Historians of science with no interest in Jung still cite the essay as serious scholarship. But notice what it is not. It is not an argument that quantum mechanics explains meaningful coincidence. Pauli never wrote that essay. Anyone who tells you a Nobel laureate used physics to prove synchronicity has not opened the book. What Pauli actually argued is subtler and in some ways more unsettling, that scientists, including the greatest ones, including himself, do not arrive at theories by pure logic acting on pure data. They arrive carrying images, preferences for symmetry, for simplicity, for certain numbers, for certain shapes, and those images shape what gets discovered. So where does this leave the actual claim? Here is where this channel has to be more careful than the videos this story usually appears in. Synchronicity is not established science. It is not accepted by mainstream psychology. It is not accepted by physics. It has never been demonstrated experimentally, and the strongest criticism of it is not that it's strange, it's that it is very hard to state in a way that could ever be shown to be false. There is a straightforward alternative account, almost certainly right about most cases. Human beings are superb pattern finders and terrible statisticians. We notice the coincidence and forget the thousands of non-coincidences around it. We remember the dream that matched and lose the hundreds that didn't. Given enough events, striking coincidences aren't merely possible, they're guaranteed. And Jung's own evidence had a serious problem. For statistical support, he leaned on the card-guessing experiments of J.B. Rhine at Duke University. Rhine's methods have been heavily criticized ever since. Above all, for testing large numbers of people, keeping the high scorers, then treating their inevitable drift back toward average as a mysterious effect, rather than the selection artifact it was. But the sharpest evidence against Jung's case doesn't come from his critics at all. It comes from Jung. In that same 1952 essay, he tried to test the idea himself. He ran a statistical experiment on the horoscopes of married couples, checking whether the aspects that astrological tradition associates with marriage turned up more often than chance in real marriages. They did not. The result was statistically insignificant, consistent with chance. He published it anyway. And by the end of the essay, he had conceded something that most of his later popularizers seem never to have read, that the statistical, quantitative approach could not establish synchronicity at all. Sit with that for a second, because it's the most admirable thing in this entire story. He designed a test of his own idea. The test came back negative. He printed the negative result in the book that was supposed to make his case. There's one more piece of this story, and it needs handling carefully, because it's usually told wrong. Among physicists, there was a long-running joke called the Pauli effect, that experimental equipment tended to fail whenever Pauli was nearby. Machines broke. Colleagues supposedly banned him from laboratories. It is a joke. A legend physicists enjoyed because Pauli was hopeless with his hands and lethal with his criticism. There is no evidence of anything but coincidence and good storytelling. What's interesting is that Pauli himself half enjoyed it. A man who had spent his life demanding evidence found something in the story he didn't want to dismiss. Not because he'd stopped being rigorous, but because he had become curious about why the mind reaches so hard for meaning in a run of accidents. So what survives once the overclaim is stripped away? Not a proof, not a vindication, not quantum mechanics explaining coincidence. What survives is the record of a first-rate physicist taking a strange question seriously for the rest of his life. Skeptically, in writing, with a collaborator he often disagreed with, in letters anyone can now read. And the question itself has not gone away. Not the mystical version, the real one. Where does the boundary between the observer and the observed actually sit? That is still a live question in the philosophy of science, and Pauli's essay on Kepler is still cited in it. The answer he and Jung reached for. One world, one underlying reality, wearing two faces, remains exactly what it was in 1952. Unproven, unfalsified, unfinished. You can feel the smaller version of their question without any physics at all. Think of the last time you learned a new word and then heard it 3 times that week. The word didn't become more common, your attention changed, and the world appeared to answer. That's the honest explanation, and almost always the right one, but notice how hard your mind works to resist it. How strongly the coincidence feels like a message. That pull toward meaning is what Pauli and Jung spent decades staring at. Not because they had proved it points at something, because neither could explain why it is quite so strong. Nothing here is settled, and this video is not an argument that it should be. What's actually here is smaller and more interesting than the myth. 2 people at the top of 2 different fields who both suspected the line we draw between mind and matter might say more about us than about the world, and who wrote to each other about it, honestly, for a quarter of a century without ever proving a thing. The physicist who predicted an invisible particle and then spent the rest of his life on a question he could not make visible. Ancient wisdom, quantum mystery, direct knowing. This is quantum gnosis.